In terms of how this panel will work, speakers are being given a maximum of 7 minutes each for their interventions, and then we'll open it to question and answers. I've been given 5 minutes for introductions and context. So the central question for today is clear from the title of the panel and from the earlier discussions we've had today. Are we witnessing a reemergence of the chemical threat? And if so, what does this mean for sustaining and making progress on chemical disarmament? The warning signs that we may be witnessing a reemergence of the chemical threat have already been alluded to. These range from use by state and non-state actors, including for assassination, as part of the military conflicts in Syria and Iraq, and allegations of use in interstate war in Ukraine. There are also concerns about how advances in science and technology, including, as we've just heard, generative AI, may impact the range of potential chemical agents and the range of actors who have access to chemical weapons. We also have seen increased disinformation around chemical as well as biological capabilities and threats, and concerns about how increasing divisions and competitions among the great powers may spill over and impede non-proliferation and disarmament. But as we've also heard, one can also tell a more positive story about the maintenance of the norm against chemical weapons in the face of the use of those weapons in Syria, about the First Amendment of the CWC schedules to include new agents, about ways for the OPCW to take action in the absence of consensus. And of course, as Haley was just alluding to in her earlier question, this panel is especially timely given the upcoming 29th session of the Conference of State Parties to the CWC, which starts on the 25th. So, our panelists for today have been asked to address one or more of the following questions. First, do you see a reemergence of the chemical threat? And if so, what do you see as its most significant manifestation? Second, what do you see as the most promising paths to address this reemerging threat? Or if you don't see such a threat, what do you see as the key hurdles to achieving universal chemical disarmament? And finally, what risks remain or may emerge in terms of possible chemical proliferation and use as a result of new technological developments? Okay, because I want to turn over as quickly as possible to our wonderful panel, and because you already have those biographies, let me just quickly introduce our speakers. We have Mr. Marcin Wróblewski, who is the Director of the Office of Strategy and Policy for the OPCW. Mr. Markus Liinonen, who is the E representative to the international organizations in The Hague. Ms. Haley Wingo, who's a researcher in the Verification and Monitoring Program at the Verification Research Training and Information Center, otherwise known as VERTEC. And Dr. Jonathan Foreman, who's a science and technology advisor at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory for the Global Science, Technology, and Policy Group in the Emerging Threats and Technology Division. Quite the title. Okay, so our speakers bring an impressive breadth and depth of both experience and knowledge. So it is with great pleasure that I turn the microphone over to them. And Haley is going to get us started.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for your fantastic questions to get us started. And I'm looking forward to serving on a panel with quite a few distinguished peers. And it's going to be a hard panel to follow after the first one, which was really, really fascinating. And just also want to say thank you to the conference organizers and to all of you for letting us talk at you for the final hour before dinner. So I'll address the first two questions that Susan posed. About whether I see a reemergence of a chemical threat and how I think we might address it. Unfortunately, I do think we have seen a worrying trend of chemical weapons use in the past few years. I won't talk today about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, although we can revisit this, of course, in the Q&A session, because I think many of you already have quite a good understanding of this. And there are even more recent examples of a continuing disregard for the CWC by some actors, or at least an attempt to abuse it by taking advantage of misunderstandings of its provisions and our capacity to respond to these. Another one of these trends is the use of nerve agents for targeted assassinations. Again, we can revisit that in the Q&A, but today I want to talk about something that's already been mentioned quite a few times today, which is the allegations of the use of riot control agents in Ukraine. Since February 2022, over 1,000 incidents involving the alleged use of riot control agents has been reported on the front lines in Ukraine. Riot control agents are permitted for domestic uses under the CWC, but their production and stockpile is also not prohibited. But their use as warfare agents is absolutely prohibited. Most of the reported incidents thus far have involved the use of CN and CS, which are more commonly known as tear gas agents. But there have also been a few allegations of chloropicrin use. And chloropicrin is actually a scheduled chemical, so absolutely is prohibited in all circumstances, regardless of context, as a riot control agent in domestic law enforcement or not. And several states have taken their own unilateral steps in response to these allegations. And as has been mentioned, these allegations have come from both sides. So Russia has accused Ukraine of using it, and Ukraine vice versa. The US in May of this year sanctioned 3 Russian government entities and 4 associated companies for the use of riot control agents in Ukraine, as well as chloropicrin. And Russia, in turn, has denied the accusations and accused Ukraine of both false flag and targeted attacks against Russian troops using these same agents. So this is obviously quite a contested environment, and we've seen a little bit of the difficulties inherent for addressing these claims and how the OPCW might go about verifying or disproving them. It's quite a minefield. There are many options available for verification under the convention, and thus far a technical assistance visit has been sent to Ukraine, as the Director General was telling us. I won't repeat many of the details that he shared, but it's worth also noting that these technical assistance visits were used in the case of the poisoning of the Skripals in Amesbury in the UK in 2018, and also the poisoning of Alexei Navalny in 2020 upon invitation by Germany when he was being treated on their territory. In both of these cases, the OPCW representatives assisted both host states within their territories with sample testing and identification of the chemical agents used against the victims. During the technical assistance visit to Ukraine this summer, the OPCW representatives, as far as I can tell, did not collect evidence, but they focused on providing Ukraine with detectors, PPE, and training, as the DG explained in his earlier remarks. A more comprehensive investigation must be formally requested by states parties due to the political contention around the issue. And an investigation in an active combat zone on top of this political consideration also requires extensive capacity within the inspectorate in the technical secretariat of the OPCW for coordinating with authorities that can safely escort inspectors into an active conflict area and fielding an experienced team that can deal with the pressures of the inherent danger to themselves while still efficiently collecting evidence with an intact chain of custody and adherence to procedures. That's not an easy task at all, in case you couldn't tell by that paragraph of requirements. Investigations like this have been done before in similar difficult circumstances, as in Syria and as in Iraq before, but they're both politically and technically difficult, but not impossible, and I think they're absolutely worth continuing to exercise as an instrument. So having just launched into a fairly pessimistic discussion of some of the more worrying developments involving chemical weapons, I would like to acknowledge the significant achievement by the OPCW, which is the destruction of all declared stockpiles of chemical weapons in July 2023. I believe this is a great example of why we should still be very optimistic about the chemical weapons disarmament and non-proliferation regime. In the destruction of all declared stockpiles, states parties to the CWC committed extensive resources to safe and transparent stockpile destruction. This was a truly ambitious undertaking, and I would hope now that this long-term goal of the OPCW has been achieved, that the energy can be turned to not just work on disposing of abandoned munitions, which is absolutely very important, but also to preventing the re-emergence of chemical weapons. Since last July, the number of personnel in the technical secretariat has remained roughly the same, but the percentage of total personnel who are in the inspectorate has declined noticeably. And I think this is a bit of a worrying trend, since if left unchecked, it could lead to a potential loss of the expertise that has been painstakingly developed through the investigations in Syria and the verification of stockpile destruction. And as the Director General said, the strength of the technical secretariat is an important deterrent function as well. This instrument is relevant for investigations of alleged use by any actor, state or non-state. And I don't think it's too late to reverse this trend. There are plenty of experts in the field, including some of my fellow panelists, who are eager to share their experiences so that future generations will not have to reinvent the wheel. And as a young researcher in the field myself, I've experienced this firsthand. So my answer to this question of how to address any reemergence can be summed up by the expression of use it or lose it. I think there might be a fear of addressing issues directly within the CWC's Executive Council and the Conference of State Parties, as we're in an era of contention within pretty much any multilateral forum, and I'm sure diplomats have taken note of how Russia has denied evidence of the Assad regime's implication of chemical weapons use in Syria. There have also been note verbals circulated in this most recent meeting of the Executive Council in October, criticizing actually the technical secretariat's note verbal in response to a Russian one. When Russia submitted evidence of some of the tests that it's conducted on its own territory, it was referring to one of its own labs, which had been acting unilaterally as an OPCW designated lab. That it is, but this phrase kind of implied the OPCW's involvement in this investigation and has not been involved in any technical assistance visit to Russia. So even if there is not sufficient and substantiated evidence by the meeting of the CSP later this month to present for determining the involved state parties' compliance or non-compliance on both sides facing the allegations, I do hope that individual states make it clear in their statements that they are paying attention to the allegations, that they strongly condemn the use of riot control agents in warfare, and that they are prepared to support the Secretariat in any further technical assistance visits or any investigation of the alleged use of chemical weapons. Statements of this sort are really important. They serve to remind any perpetrators that non-compliance with the Convention does not go unnoticed, and they deter any future would-be perpetrators who otherwise may be emboldened by a lack of public condemnation. I believe EU member states are very well placed to continue carefully evaluating the evidence presented to all parties thus far and fulfilling this role of maintaining vigilance and sending very clear messages at this month's CSP. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to turn to Marcus now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening. Today I will be speaking in my personal capacity, so whatever I say does not necessarily reflect any position from the European Union. My remarks are based on the fact that I have been the EU representative in the OPCW now since 2018, and I have seen, for example, 2 failed review conferences, at least partially failed or formally failed. So that gives also a bit of perspective on the developments related to the organization. So the of the questions that were handed down to us, I picked the following. What are the most promising paths to address the re-emergence of the chemical threat? And I would like to offer you my recipe that contains 4 ingredients, 4 paths. And the first one is keep the implementing body of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the OPCW, fit for purpose. And to start with, I think we need to have an X-ray of the implementing body, that what is it and what it is not. I would like to remind you that it is a fairly small organization with less than 500 budgeted staff, actually 470 to be exact. The yearly budget of the organization for operations and for everything is only about 80 million euros. It is a non-career organization, which means that there is a major rotation and loss of experience and knowledge. This is in particular case with the inspectors. Experts like them are difficult to find, especially after the destruction of declared chemical weapons stockpiles, because these experts are not necessarily anymore needed actually in states parties. But with this workforce, limited I would say, they make more than 200 routine industry inspections per year and deliver extensive capacity building activities. And in both, the demand is bigger than the capacity to deliver. The OPCW needs to be resourced accordingly, not only as regards the human resources, but financial resources. There's a dependency on voluntary financial contributions. EU, with its member states, is the biggest provider of voluntary contributions, but I think that we all agree that in an ideal case, the financing of all OPCW activities would come from a regular budget. The OPCW needs to continue to closely cooperate and deepen cooperation and info exchange and analysis with law enforcement agencies, including Europol and Interpol. the importance of these preventive mode activities and cooperation should not be underestimated, because it also provides states parties a state of play of the threat level. And finally, the OPCW needs to harness all new technologies to keep fit for purpose. Artificial intelligence has been today, we dwelt lengthily on it due to its importance, and it's the first one that comes into mind. But serious work about its ramifications to the implementation will have to continue and deepen. Then I would move on to a second ingredient, second path, and that has to do with a update of the Chemical Weapons Convention, or at least partial update of it. What was negotiated in the 1990s and entered into force in 1997 is not necessarily up to date and in sync with real world anymore. And this applies in particular, I would say, three baskets. The first one is the chemical industry inspection regime. It requires modernization, update, uplift, redo, whatever you want to call it, because chemicals are all over the place. How can we be sure that the right chemical production sites are inspected? Let's keep that in mind. Then, are the lists of scheduled chemicals up to date? The three lists have been updated once to add some chemicals from the Novichok group some time ago. And finally, important discrepancies between import and exports of chemicals is a commonplace. Reconciling this information is a real headache for the OPCW Technical Secretariat. Then I would move on to a third path, and that has to do with the investigation and attribution activity of the organization. In the last 10 years or so, there have been cases of chemical weapons use, mostly poisonings of individuals by state actors. But in Syria, the chemical weapons use has been methodical, organized, based on an extensive chemical weapons development and production program. Following up to the good work done by the GIM, so the coordinated action between the UN and the OPCW, the OPCW IIT, Investigation and Identification Team, has, together GIM and IIT have found and proved that chemical weapons have been used on 9 occasions in Syria. This activity, attribution activity, and investigation activity has resulted in considerable knowledge and expertise, and this has to be turned into something permanent. And one final part is related to prosecution for the use of chemical weapons. And I know this is completely out of the remit of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and I won't need to repeat that, so that's clear for everyone. But those who have used the chemical weapons must and will be held accountable, but the question is how. The evidence is not in short supply. The OPCW is providing that to the IIIM, and at the same time, there is a serious work effort going on to find ways to prosecute internationally those who have used chemical weapons. And I think that we can expect results from an 12-member strong informal group by the next summer. So, concluding, Ms. Chair, if I may, I know I'm a bit over time. There are huge challenges and work to do in these 4 work strands. But the good news is, for me at least, that the global norm against use of chemical weapons, the taboo, is still there. It may have experienced erosion, and as my boss said in the opening remarks, it is under stress. But there are 193 countries. There's South Sudan hopefully joining soon. None of the state parties have left it. One has been deprived of its privileges and immunities, but they are still there because the OPCW and Chemical Weapons Convention has a winning formula because it combines capacity building and is attractive to especially many countries in the global south. And finally, on the other hand, the horizon does not look very good. There are threats, non-state actors, new technologies, new delivery mechanisms, and so forth. And also, finally, prolonged use of right control agents by Russia. Yeah, well, you know, it's a dangerous situation to the credibility of the convention. But I'm confident that, for example, Ukrainians will soon provide the evidence, and which in turn will be a further deterrence against re-emergence. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now turning over to Marston.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, it's a challenge to speak after the boss, so I will try not to repeat, but if I do, sorry for this. But I think I will start with repetition to underline, because I think it's very important that in this we are in this post-destruction phase, and but one may ask question whether we are in the safer world, and I would say yes, because 73,000 metric tons of chemicals which were purely designed to kill people have been successfully destroyed. So they could have killed hundreds of thousands of people. But is our mission over? No. We have to, as Director General said, we have to retain capabilities to verify destruction as the abandoned and old chemical weapons destruction process continues. And also, there are 4 countries out of the convention and at least 1 known possessor state. So we need to keep these capabilities. Second, of course, the emergence, and we have to do everything to prevent this. Maybe re-emergence is already there, so maybe reuse of chemical weapons, I would say, as unlike with other WMDs, use on chemical weapon taboo has been broken. Perpetrators, as was mentioned by Markus, has not been brought to justice. And we have witnessed different forms of use of chemical weapons, from classic on battlefields, lethal, non-lethal, in use against civilians in the civil war, terrorist attacks, or targeted killing. So I think that this is a low-hanging fruit for all for bad guys, for non-state actors as well as state actors. And especially with the new technologies. You heard that we had a lot of meetings, and the Director General described what I would say, using the term of threat assessment, that the threat is tangible but not imminent. But it may change in the course of upcoming years, as you heard. So the design of the new toxic formulas, or well-known formulas with new pathways, is easy, but production is not easy so far. But let's not forget that actually Daesh 10 years ago started its own research on toxicity of biological and chemical agents. So 10 years ago already the terrorist groups started to do this research. And I think that one thing was not said, so why this might be very tempting for state and non-state actors to use new chemicals, although it might be difficult to produce at this stage, because then the defense and protection against new toxic chemicals can be impossible, a very difficult one. And also treatment of people poisoned or affected by those chemicals. But AI is not only a threat, but also a challenge, not only posed by malicious actors, but also, I would say, by the growing industry. So industry is growing in quality, but also in quantity. And Markus also touched upon this inspections. So this is a big challenge for inspections. There are pharmaceutical industry which produces very toxic medicines below in the small numbers, which are below the thresholds, and so there are no inspections. They are not inspectable. So this is also the issue for the convention. Convention was designed for very different purpose, and the thresholds in the conventions for toxic chemicals are quite high. So what shall we do with this problem? And not to repeat. One thing. Jim also mentioned the conference which took place in Rabat. This conference was a first of this, I would say, of this size, and there were three, I would say, main outcomes of this conference. So first, there was a building awareness among those 160 participants from 43 countries, and there was a quite common understanding that AI will have impact on the implementation of the convention in both good ways and bad ways. And I would like here to also draw your attention to our actions, which is AI Challenge, which was launched in June. And there were projects by member states, how we can use proposals, how we can use AI to our benefit. So we also concentrate on this positive side of AI. Then second, this conference set the issue of AI in the chemistry in the context of the global discussions on new technologies and artificial intelligence in particular. And third, I think it will inform further discussions and initiatives which will deal with the issue of new technologies and artificial intelligence in chemistry, in particular in the context of non-proliferation and disarmament, and will be a stimulus for international cooperation for the peaceful use in chemistry with the use of new technologies. So I will stop here and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Jonathan, over to you.
All right, can I put up the slides, please? So it's always difficult to be the last speaker of the day. Lots of interesting insights and thoughts. So I thought I would try to make getting through my presentation a little bit easier by showing some pictures. So just this idea of re-emergence. I mean, I think it's important to appreciate that chemicals have been used to cause harm in warfare or other nefarious purposes since ancient times. If we think about the Chemical Weapons Convention and its origins and the influences that led to its verification regime, you think about the First World War, industrial scale use of chemicals, and the stockpiling of various nerve agents, blister agents. One of the blister agents, sulfur mustard, many people don't realize was actually known in scientific literature almost 100 years before the First World War, and it was being studied for scientific purposes, not as a weapon. We heard about the completion of the destruction of the declared stockpiles, a really amazing and important milestone in the history of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we think about re-emergence. When I hear we've destroyed stockpiles and now we're worried about re-emergence, does re-emergence mean industrial scale production of stockpile chemicals? Because if you think about the current verification regime, if stockpiles is your threat scenario, industrial capacity to produce chemicals would be something that you would want to verify. It's a worthwhile question to ask. Is that the modern chemical risk? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. We have a whole spectrum of potentially toxic chemicals. They bleed over scientifically into the biological side if you think about toxins and bioregulators. Policy-wise, we often try to put very strict lines between chem and bio. There's a lot of good reasons for that and how you respond to things and how you think about things. But scientifically, there's blurred boundaries, and that's always been the case of science throughout its history. We've heard a lot about AI. Well, I enjoyed the talk about AI and we need guardrails. So I asked an AI tool to tell me what the guardrails look like compared to the tsunami of possible chemical structures that can be predicted. And you see the picture here on your left. But I want to also point out that using computational tools to discover toxic chemicals is not actually new. Our tools to do it now are much better. But people that do drug development have been trying to predict toxic chemicals because the definition of a toxic chemical is that it has chemical action on life process. Well, that's a medicine. You want your medicines to be toxic enough to have a medical effect, but not too toxic or not toxic enough so that it doesn't have a medical effect. And as we think about chemicals and how we make them, all the tools we have now start to change, and they look different, and how you think about them, the kind of chemical engineering that happens, maybe is a bit different. There's also an interesting challenge. I can predict millions of molecules in silico in a computer, but in order to turn them into a weapon, I have to bring those molecules into the physical world. And that has its own challenges, some easy to overcome, some not. And then we talk about all this emerging technologies, and not to discount that, because I think we have to be diligent, we have to keep an eye on what's happening there. But think about the last 10 years of chemical weapons use. Sulfur mustard and chlorine gas in Syria. These are chemicals that have been known for 200 years. Burning sulfur, a sulfur mine set on fire in Iraq in 2016, and you can see the plumes of the choking agent sulfur dioxide from a satellite image. The nerve agents, even if targeted assassination attempts, are chemicals known from the 20th centuries. We heard a lot about riot control agents and tear gas. And then these are not new chemicals. Maybe dropping a tear gas canister from a drone is something new. On the other hand, we had an incident with VX where somebody rubbed the chemicals on someone's face. And I remember when that happened, and people said, that's impossible. You can't have a binary VX delivered by hand. Well, apparently you can. So lots of things to think about. There also are more possible chemicals that can exist than there are atoms in the universe. They can't exist all at the same time. For regulators, hope that makes them a little happier. They represent a variety of hazards, some toxic, some other types of hazards. And it's often not the case that we don't think of a chemical as belonging on a list of a hazard until something happens, whether that's a new chemical that we're concerned about, a new unexpected weaponization of a chemical we know about, a novel use combined with other technologies, or mixtures of chemicals. And this is a really big scientific challenge to address these types of issues. So I'll wrap up here by saying, how do we think about countering this? And I'll talk about it first from a scientific perspective. We can't afford to be afraid of emerging science and technology. And I wouldn't even say emerging. I think if you think about AI tools, we all carry these. There's lots of AI in our lives. We don't even realize it. Can you use some of those informatics capabilities to help recognize the tripwires or the signs and signatures of whether it's somebody having been exposed to a chemical or signatures of somebody trying to make chemicals in a nefarious way? Can you incorporate these tools into the types of analysis we do in laboratories to better detect and identify chemicals that are not in the libraries and our analytical instruments? And can you predict chemical properties that help us respond to them or understand what we might want to put controls on, being in a more proactive way? Now, that's a very technical, science and technology-driven approach to solving some of these problems. But I think it's really important to point out that chemical weapons is more than chemicals, and science and technology provide tools, very useful tools, but if you just make a measurement of a chemical, that doesn't tell you anything about the context of how it was used, how it got there, or all the other things you might want to know. And so we can't be afraid of science, but we also can't keep it in a silo and just look at it when we say, oh, we need a scientific opinion. It's something that needs to be incorporated in the way we do decision making and the way we think about approaching chemical deterrence. So I will stop there. I appreciate your attention and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much to everybody. So I was going to try to say something about we moved from the big issues to the small issues, but then I couldn't figure out which were the big ones and which were the small ones. So I think I want to say we've talked about a range of hugely interconnected issues. I think one connection I would like to make to earlier discussion is we talked about geopolitical competition and the fate of arms control in a world with geopolitical competition re-emerging, and the need for sustained work to let mutual interests re-emerge. When I think about the re-emergence of the chemical threat and some of the things we've been talking about, the politics of what we've been talking about, we've clearly seen a decline in an understanding that chemical weapons disarmament is in everybody's interest. And I think that's something that we need to grapple with, right? So we need to do the hard work to prepare for that re-emergence, but we have to think about what are the conditions that will allow us to see and help contribute to a re-emergence of that recognized common interest. But I'm going to shut up and turn it over for you. So do you have questions for our panel? Yeah, back here.
Good evening. My name is Szymon Bocheński. I'm from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And of course, speaking in my personal capacity, I would like to thank all the panelists and the organizers of the conference for putting more focus on chemical issues. Ultimately, the OPCW, as the only organization, has to face actual use of one category of weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapon, in recent years. In this context, I agree with all the speakers that we have been facing something which I call crawling re-emergence of chemical weapons. And we have seen their use to murder or attempt murdering individuals. We have seen its use as an area denial agent. We have seen use as a weapon of terror. So there is no single pattern. And this only adds to the complexity of the challenge. And the OPCW has to adapt to all those scenarios to be effective. I also agree that the chemical taboo is still strong because we haven't seen any massive use of chemical weapons which would question the taboo itself. And now the organization did great work in addressing cases of chemical weapons use, investigating those allegations. However, of course, we can see that some states they question the work done by the organization. They question the integrity, the professionalism, the neutrality of some of the OPCW staff. So my question is, on the science side, are there any things or technologies that can help us in investigating allegations of chemical weapons use in that way that the result, appear more objective and are difficult to question? And maybe a second question on the re-emergence side. There is at least one big state party which is believed that it did not fully dismantle its chemical weapons program. And with scientific and technological developments, I'm afraid that it may be tempting for some other states in the future to keep clandestine, secret, small programs. Of course, the convention has embedded mechanisms to deal with those issues, but mechanisms such as a challenge inspection was not used for political and other reasons. So my question is there any way around it? I would be interested in views of the panelists on this issue as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think there's a question right next to you, if you can.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Burg. I'm at CBWNet and the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. My question is directed to Mr. Leinonen. You talked about prosecuting use cases of chemical weapons. One problem that still remains is that the Rome Statute adopts a different terminology for chemical weapons or for the crimes in comparison to the Chemical Weapons Convention. There have been amendments, unfortunately not really been taken up by many states, and even these amendments don't implement the same definition as the Chemical Weapons Convention. Thus, many states implemented only the Rome Statute, not the obligations of the Chemical Weapons Convention, at least when it comes to universal jurisdiction. Are there any pushes from the European Union to coordinate, maybe to go back to the Belgium amendment proposal, to move this forward and actually get states to sign up to a more extensive or more fitting definition of chemical weapons use as used in the Rome Statute?
Okay, thank you. And then we have two over here, and then we'll take those, and then we'll come back for another round.
My name is Precious, and I'm an intern at the ICC and also one of the mentees of the ongoing mentorship program organized by the Istituto Affari Internazionali and VCDMP. My question is also like an addition to what the earlier the person who just asked the question asked, and based on your statement about the possibility to prosecute individuals for the use of chemical weapons. Although the Rome Statute does not expressly state that possibility, I believe that the wordings of Article 8, Paragraph 2E of the Rome Statute allows for the prosecution of individuals for the use of biological weapons, because this article states that violations of laws and customs applicable in armed conflicts within the established framework of international law could be prosecuted. And the key question would be whether the use of chemical weapons would constitute a violation of laws and customs established within the framework of international law. And the question and the answer would be yes. Also, certain particular articles, Article XII, expressly stated that the use of poison or poison weapons and asphyxiating gases could be criminalized. So even though there's an ongoing debate about whether this article of the Rome Statute could allow the prosecution, I believe that the wordings of the Rome Statutes are pretty much clear and could be interpreted and could entitle the courts to prosecute individuals for the use of chemical weapons, since it mentions the use of poisonous gases and the rest. And then my second question goes to...
Sorry, can we just do one because we're going to run out of time? Okay. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Carlo Trezza from the NATO Defense College Foundation. I would like the speakers to address the question of the other international means to contrast weapons of mass destruction, in particular chemical weapons. I referred to Resolution 1540 of the Security Council and export control regime, Australia group. What is the relation, and is there a cooperation between the OPCW and these other bodies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you much. We'll come back to you if we can for your second question. Do you want to start?
Thank you for the questions. And yes, the possibility to go to the ICC. Well, it's a theoretical question because the UN Security Council is blocked, and I don't see any signs of being deblocked. Hence, there's nothing to coordinate. So it's not impossible that the EU would have a role, but it's not an actual situation. But I would agree with you that not being a lawyer and so forth, but I think that the basis is there. That's why there have been attempts to refer the case to the ICC. And then one word about the clandestine chemical weapons programs. Indeed, I mean, that is a concern. It is addressed by many states in the Conference of States Parties as well as Executive Council meetings. And obviously, no proof has been presented, but I think that in the rather shorter than longer run, the simple open source information will give us quite good hints if these kind of programs do exist, but it has not been the case yet. I think I'll leave the time also for others to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, there is a cooperation, very strict, very close cooperation with the 1540 committee. We are we have consultations with them. We respond if there is a request for assistance from the OPCW. So we very closely cooperate with both formats. So this is and like with other international organizations also. Yes, Australia Group as well, yes.
All right, well, thank you for the questions. So I'll start with Mr. Boczynski. Thank you. There absolutely are ways that science can help in investigations. But I think it's also important when you think about science and especially new science, to ask the question, does this allow us to do something that we can't already do? And the answer oftentimes is no. Does it allow us to do things we can already do in different ways? The answer is oftentimes yes, but what does it require? And is the different way validated? So if you think about forensic science, if you're doing investigations, even if it's for chemical events or nuclear for that matter, the basic principles of forensic science, the basic techniques of forensic science, and the forensic science that doesn't actually involve chemical and nuclear materials is just as important as understanding the science and the capabilities to address the hazardous properties of chemicals. There are differences in how you would collect evidence, there are differences in how you would collect samples, but the basics of what it means to follow standard protocols to bring something into a courtroom that can be accepted as robust and irrefutable evidence does not change. We can talk about this on one of the breaks, because I've been doing a lot of this type of work in my professional life lately. Not investigations, but working with investigators on how to think about these kind of things. I think and this was mentioned, Article 8 of the Convention, paragraph 6, says that the organization shall consider using advances in science and technology for verification. I think that's a wonderful thing to have in writing in the Convention, and it speaks to, as new capabilities come forward, can they be leveraged? But the question you're always going to run into is, how can you trust them and how do you validate them? And that's really important for anything with science. We've talked a lot about chemical forensics over the years that you and I worked together. Chemical forensics is a really interesting way to try to understand the origin of a chemical, but it also requires that you have some context, some kind of reference materials, things that you can compare to. And then I want to just mention two last quick points. One is on the footprint of a chemical program. We talk about new technologies being able to make it easier to hide things, but I think there's a context there too. If you're generating tons of material, it's really hard to hide, no matter whether you use a microreactor system or a traditional chemical production. On the other hand, if I take the microscale glassware I used when I was an undergraduate chemistry student, I could hide that easier than I could hide a microreactor system, because a microreactor system requires a series of pumps and computers and other things to run it. So it's really what scale are you talking about being easy or hard to hide? And then I was interested to hear what was just said about open source information. And I think it's important to appreciate, and this comes back to my own experience at the OPCW, when the schedule changes were being talked about in 2019, there was a lot of searching into the chemistry literature to see what had been published. And people were coming up with scientific papers and saying, look, this is proof that somebody was up to no good. It was taken out of context. It was used to fuel disinformation. I think open source use is really important for the reasons that were said. But I also think that in order to do it well, you need to have people with domain expertise that are looking at these things and not taking information out of context to use to fuel narratives that are often false. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I think that is a great point, and I'll start then on the question about open source. As it so happens, I'm actually involved with a project that's looking to do this as a proof of concept with the Royal United Services Institute. And I think it is, what Jonathan said is absolutely worth bearing in mind, is that you must distinguish between what the purpose is. So open source, there is a suite of capabilities that we're trying to use, and as I think it was Marcus said, they can provide hints, but it's a very different thing from a fully fielded challenge inspection. So keeping that distinction in mind is very important. And then on Rome Statute and 1540, I think that has been covered by the other panelists, but going back to technologies that can help protect the objectivity of the OPCW, I think it's a good question, and we've already seen actually that there has been some hit back at the technical secretariat for accusations of it being not objective in its evaluations of some of the evidence submitted to it by states parties recently. And so I do think it's worth bearing in mind that the inspectorate's job is not to provide a judgment on compliance or non-compliance. So it presents the reports neutrally. The only exception to this would be the IIT, which had a mandate for attribution, but that was kind of an exception from most inspection mechanisms within the OPCW. So really, it's the states parties that make a judgment on compliance or not compliance, and it is incredibly hard to accuse a full multilateral forum that adopts, ideally by consensus, but really by a 2/3 majority most of the time, on substantial issues regarding treaty compliance of being biased. And I think we've seen a similar situation actually play out within the BWC, with some of the consultation and clarification mechanisms being drawn out over allegations of biological weapons program in Ukraine. But despite those being drawn out by one state party, most of the multilateral forum agreed that the concerns had been resolved. Thank you.
Okay, great. Another round of questions. So we have one here. There's two back there, and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, hello. I'm Renata Dall'Acqua from the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Thank you very much for all the panelists for the interesting presentations and reflections. My question is actually to the EU representative, Mr. Leinonen. You put forward some ingredients of how you would like, to see the future of the chemical weapons regime and the convention. And I know you cannot cover everything, but from my perspective, I would be interested in hearing more your views on what can be done to assist victims and survivors. How do you evaluate given that you've been there for a long time, how do you evaluate how the organization and the member states have addressed this issue? Are there things we can learn from humanitarian disarmament treaties, and so on and so forth? Thank you.
And there's
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. My name is Igor Kutsar, and I'm from the EU delegation in Geneva. Thank you all the panelists for interesting presentations. We heard some optimistic comments that we are living in a safer world because we've been able to destroy a huge amount of chemicals. At the same time, the discussion was clearly evident that we are entering more challenging world because of the artificial intelligence. So I would like to ask, because what we heard, that there should be a production of chemical control in a more proactive way. So what would be the role of the OPCW in terms of the CWC implementation in current artificial intelligence era? And what would be actually the entry point for the OPCW to provide production of chemical control? And is there any discussion in the OPCW how the organization can contribute to the broader call on artificial intelligence regulations? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bianca Voikan. I'm a current mentee and a recent graduate from the War Studies Department at King's College London. I have a question to the panel. To what extent is it possible to monitor the progress that non-state actors have already made or may continue to make in developing and weaponizing chemical agents and delivery systems with the support of AI? And can we differentiate actors who have expressed intent to develop chemical weapon capabilities and conducted chemical experiments like Al-Qaeda, from others like Aum Shinrikyo, whose intentions regarding WMD are more ambiguous? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Sigurd Skjelstad. I'm from the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Several members of the panel have spoken about the need to change, to bring modifications to the verification regime, or at least to change how industry verification is done. Now, if you look at the instances where chemical weapons have been used, either Syria, Russia, or others, none of those incidents could have been, in fact, prevented by industry verification, either because industry was not implicated, or the chemical weapons were produced at sites that were not declared. So is this really the way forward, then to change a system that hasn't been able to prevent chemical weapons from being used?
Okay, and then can we come back to the front, please? Back to the front.
My question is to Haley. During your presentation, you mentioned the work of the technical committee and some visits undertaken to Russia and Ukraine about accusations of the use of chemical weapons. I'm unsure if you worked on the investigations undertaken by the OPCW in Syria, but if you did, what key lessons would you take from the investigations that were undertaken in Syria, and has the lessons learned from the investigations influenced current policies and procedures, and how would these lessons be relevant in the current investigations and work ongoing in Russia and Ukraine?
Okay, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes or so, so if you can keep your comments fairly brief to that wide range of questions.
Okay, well, I leave some of the questions to my fellow panelists, but picking on the last one, so the OPCW visits and investigations in Syria, I think that they have proven that the OPCW is technically up to the task. But as the world changes, also do techniques, also investigation techniques, they need to change. And the IIT has come up with a wealth of new techniques in terms of forensics or witness interviews. And indeed, and this comes back to the issue of huge rotation. Now, from the original IIT team, there's one person left, and we are talking about few years. So there's an urgency in transferring this knowledge and expertise they have gained and make it somehow embedded as a permanent capacity. And the European Union, I'm happy to announce that is with 2.5 million, 1.6 million euros is actually helping this to happen. And perhaps another one, the victims issue. You touch upon a very, very, very important aspect that has to do with the Chemical Weapons Convention and the functioning of the OPCW. However, the Chemical Weapons Convention it's for state parties, and that gives you the flavor of how activities are done. Now, and how victims are mainly involved, it is they are in the same category as the civil society. So they are present, for example, in the Conference of State Parties. You know, they can have their, they can ask for the floor under certain conditions. They have their exhibitions and so forth. But I would say that. The OPCW as such this is not the main kind of a work strand for them. I would say that from the victim's point of view, the fourth ingredient I mentioned, which is outside of the remit of the OPCW, that is highly important, that they get the satisfaction that justice will be done one day. And that is the message that we are getting, the EU and the OPCW, everybody is getting that something has to be done. 10 years cannot pass without something happening, that the responsible will be, facing what they have done. So now there's at least a little bit of hope in the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to echo Marcos, which I think you've given great points, and I will add only a little bit. But on the lessons learned from Syria, I was not involved. But I absolutely recommend reading, as Marcus said, the IIT reports. There's been a lot of fantastic evidence collection, and they are many, many pages long. I don't know if they're quite 100 pages, but they're close to it, with just chock full of evidence that was then presented and could be acted upon. And I think preserving know-how is a really, really important aspect of that. A lot of these former inspectors that were involved in Syria are still around and are still actively engaging and contributing to discussions and trying to preserve this transfer of knowledge. But because the OPCW has a 7-year turnover period, most of them are no longer at the OPCW. So I think that we're in a key phase now, actually, where we need to capture that knowledge and get them involved with continued trainings while they're still able to contribute. I think the question, too, on how we can identify to what extent non-state actors have acquired a capability, sometimes they slip up, but also oftentimes better and improved outreach to some of the industries that develop the tools that we're worried they might use is really quite warranted. As an example of this, I think Cloud Labs was mentioned in an earlier presentation. I was in a conference recently where somebody was giving a presentation on the convergence of cloud labs and how they could be abused. And they said that the cloud lab that they'd reached out to for their research, unrelated to their thinking about how it could be abused, but just as a scientific researcher, was not aware of this threat at all. So I think we need to do a really good job of figuring out exactly what it is we're worried about, and then reaching out to those industries and making sure that they understand, hey, there's something called the CWC, there's something called the BWC, and there are many, many mechanisms through which we want to monitor potential misuse of your technologies and get their engagement on that. And that builds into another question, which is none of the recent uses could have been prevented by industry verification, but I think there's a good point to be made for maintaining industry engagement. The CWC and the OPCW have a very unique relationship with industry compared to a lot of the other non-proliferation regimes. I'm thinking mostly of the BWC. But this has been a massive issue that kind of constrains the BWC's ability for outreach and raising that awareness and promoting responsible conduct. So I'll leave it to other panelists to speak to, whether it's worth reevaluating the inspection mechanism, but I think absolutely it's worth maintaining some amount of industry engagement. Thank you.
Well, quite a wealth of topics to comment on in less than 2 minutes. Thinking about AI and the OPCW, I mean, AI tools are so useful these days for information processing and some of the things that you can do with them to do routine business applications. So I don't see that the OPCW can't be adopting that. And I think having worked there, I know people are thinking about some of these tools, although we don't always call them AI. In terms of regulating chemicals, I mean, there's estimated to be about 350,000 chemicals that are around the world for commercial purposes, and there's over 200 million that are known, and we haven't even started to discover what's out there in the chemical universe. But AI tools that help you predict chemical properties, if you're developing a chemical for large-scale consumption or use, maybe are really useful in a proactive way. Those chemists in 1822 that were inventing sulfur mustard, if they had an AI system that could have told them what that chemical could do and how it might require some special handling, maybe they would have picked some other chemicals to do their electrophilic addition studies. So these are things to think about. Monitoring non-state actors is an interesting question. I think the only thing I can say is, well, it depends on what information you have and what you can know. But it does bring up an interesting question, because Shinrikyo, they basically built a pilot plant for chemical production. That's not so easy to hide, but they built it. At the same time, their weaponization system on the Tokyo subway was a sharpened umbrella. Were people less concerned because they didn't think they had the sophistication to be able to weaponize this chemical, so that's why they didn't pay attention? So these are questions I think are worth asking. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And on inspections and its challenge to inspections, I mentioned before, so this is a real challenge, because we as technical secretariat, we are in the hands of the member states. And we cannot conduct inspections on ourselves. We can only inspect places which are declared by member states. and they are declared because of the requirements of the convention, of the schedules attached to the convention, when the production is at the certain amount. So this is the problem, and this needs to be addressed. How new toxic chemicals below the threshold, how to conduct inspections, but also this is challenge for inspectors as the number of production facilities is growing. So to conduct facilities in the declared sites, it's also a challenge. So, and definitely new technologies could help us to provide inspections, but also on clandestine programs of member states, technical secretariat cannot conduct such inspections unless it is requested by member states. There are certain instruments in the convention, like challenge inspection, but then everything should be initiated by a member state. Thank you.
Just on the question about industrial education and engagement, it seemed, if I understood the question correctly, it was that none of the recent attacks we've seen used commercial industries, so therefore is commercial industry engagement worthwhile? It seems to me the very fact that none of the recent attacks we've seen involved commercial industries actually suggests that maybe it is very worthwhile, right? There's a negative correlation there that people aren't using commercial industries, perhaps because of the engagement and outreach and inspection system. So I want to thank you for your attention, especially at this late hour and this long day. I want to thank our panelists for their insights and willingness to engage with all your questions. So please join me in giving them a round of applause.